So, the research that I'm talking about today is about a novel application of what's called a radiometric dating technique to historical architecture in almost the opposite side of the Pacific to what Corinne just presented on, in the southeast corner of French Polynesia in a place called the Mangareva Islands. Um, in the Mangareva Islands, the first Catholic missionaries to settle in that part of Polynesia for the long term arrived in the late 1830s. They brought with them a cadre of what are called frères bâtisseurs, or builder brothers, who were skilled experts in construction, European style construction, who were brought in to build things like churches and chapels and cathedrals, as well as housing for the missionaries. They also taught the Polynesian Catholic converts how to build using European construction techniques. Um, and I've been thinking about these houses, especially a lot, that were mostly lived in by ordinary Mangarevan families. And you can see one of the examples here. The form of the house looks very, quote, European, but the building materials and the people who built the house were all largely Polynesian. They were Mangarevan families. Um, and this research was published late last month in the journal Antiquity. The conversation solicited a short version of the article from me, which was viewed many, many times. It also got picked up and translated into French, which was very satisfying because that's obviously one of the main languages in the islands where I've been working. And the Yeah, so the article got a lot of attention and was sort of shared with a lot of publics, including the people who live in French Polynesia. I should take a step back and say this is part of a much larger project on the historical archaeology of the Mangareva Islands that I've been working on since 2019. So again, that theme of really investing time in building relationships with people in the islands also sort of resonates with how I approach things. In addition to acknowledging the Gadigal Wongal people whose land I'm presenting from, I'd like to acknowledge the Mangarevan people, who are the traditional owners of the lands where these sites are located, and whose permission is necessary to get research permits from the Direction de la Culture et du Patrimoine in Tahiti in order to make sure that we're working according to the sort of legal and ethical obligations of these islands. Um, and uh, people might be familiar with the more commonly known method of radiocarbon, which uses the stable decay rates of carbon 14, which decays to carbon 12, 5,730 years, if anyone's wondering, is the half life of that kind of decay cycle. There's a similar decay cycle from uranium 238 down to thorium 230. These are isotopes that become fixed in branch corals. And this is a technique that has been really pioneered in Polynesian archaeology, particularly in Hawaiian archaeology, but also in the Society Islands in French Polynesia. But generally looking at the pre-European history, so things like coral offerings on Marae or coral abraders and rock shelters that tell you when the first people arrived on the island. Um, my interest is in the more recent past and how oceanic people um, adapted to situations of European colonialism. Um, and this dating method is really important for me, um, partly because in the recent past, radiocarbon doesn't really work for if you're less than 400 years old, there's not really enough carbon 14 left in the samples to get a reliable date. And there's other complicated things that I won't get into. Um, Uranium thorium does work right up to the present. and it has super narrow error ranges. So radiocarbon dates get you plus or minus 20, plus or minus 40 years. This gets you like plus or minus 2. And when they were developing the method, they went and broke some living corals off the reef to make sure. And sure enough, the result was 0 years BP before present, plus or minus 3 or something like that. Um, so as you can see, there are these branch coral blocks which come from the coral genus Acropora, with still sort of very unweathered looking branches present in the blocks that people were using to build up the walls. Um, and so dating these coral houses was an important thing to try to do because, the missionaries and the way they write about things, we know exactly when they consecrated the cathedral in Ricotea. We know exactly when they built the different churches on Akamaru and Aukena and Taravai. We know when the boys and girls schools were built. What we have is the majority of coral structures, these houses that were lived in by Mangarevan families, are vaguely mentioned as going up sometime between the 1840s and the 1870s. We don't necessarily have kind of specific dates. So being able to date these individual buildings helps to give us a kind of um, micro lens on when how old these construction materials are. There's a bit of complexity there, which I'll explain later on. But in principle, it allows us to get the direct dates for when the corals were last alive. It also helped in thinking about our excavations. So this particular house is actually the one where I noticed the unweathered branch corals in the building material, um, and had that kind of light bulb moment of, oh, I can actually get dates for these things. And archaeologists are obsessed with dates because that's one of our fundamental questions. Before we start asking things about sort of how and why, we need to know what, when, and where. Um, and so as we were working on this particular house, I noticed that there was a branch coral block that we could sample. And then I started noticing it everywhere. And as we were excavating, we found this pit with loose sediment. That's that sort of dark circle in the top left image, that contained hundreds of fish bones, pieces of large shellfish like whelks, and troca, so things that people were eating, um, dozens of alcoholic beverage containers, dozens of fragments of what are probably cooking pots. And the hypothesis is this pit probably represents a single event that took place arguably just before the house was constructed, because you wouldn't want an open rubbish pit in your house and anywhere, but especially not in the humid tropics. Um, and then, so they had a sort of little feast, a little party, and then they would have sealed the pit over and had a, construction, sort of collective construction exercise to build the house. So I also had a fresh branch coral from that pit. The dating results overlapped. So the branch coral from the pit, I think, is 1848 plus or minus 4. The branch coral from the wall is 1846 plus or minus 2. So you have this overlapping date that suggests that sequence of events between having the feast, digging a pit, dumping all the rubbish in it, and then covering it up, and then building the walls of the house next door is happening very almost simultaneously. So probably within a few days, maybe a week, those activities took place, and so it gives us this opportunity to say we can now kind of place people and what they're doing in this context, um, within a place that is changing very rapidly. And this kind of choral architecture is really appropriated by the Mangarevan people. It's exported to neighboring archipelagos, including the Tuamotus and the Austral Islands, where that expands our sample size from dozens to hundreds, conceivably, of these buildings of, again, unknown dates when they were constructed. Um, and eventually, when the Catholics were a little more established in French Polynesia, when it came time to build the main cathedral in Papeete, which is still today the capital of French Polynesia. It was actually a group of 80 Mangarevans that were sent over in the 1860s to build that cathedral. So these houses are very important to local identities. They foster a sense, these coral buildings sort of foster a sense of local pride for Mangarevan people because they consider themselves sort of the builders of historical Polynesia. The complexity that came back with these dating results, which are from a lab in Brisbane called the University of Queensland Radiogenic Isotope Facility, um, are, as with most sort of scientific results, you answer maybe one set of questions. Can I apply this method to the more sort of recent past and this form of coral architecture that's kind of really interesting in this part of the world? But then you have anomalous things that happen that make you go, huh, I wonder why that is. And that drives sort of further research. Um, and so these are the dates. You can see the majority of them cluster in that sort of 1830s, 1840s, which is kind of what we would expect, a sort of big sort of pulse of building activities shortly after the Mangarevan population converts to Roman Catholicism and starts building these kinds of houses. We also have a couple that are too old, including two dates that are so old that they are before the first European encounters in the region. So before the British missionary ship Duff came in 1797, there were no sort of direct encounters with Europeans among the Mangarevan population. Um, so what's happening? And the hypothesis is that these old corals, these two old dates, are probably coming from blocks that had come from parts of the nearshore reefs where the coral had already died before it was cut from the reef, but it still looks relatively sort of quote fresh or unweathered. Um, and we know that can happen in the way that reefs form. You can imagine the way that the Great Barrier Reef, portions of it are bleaching, portions of it are alive and actively growing, and the difference between those can be, a matter of years or decades over the span of a few meters. So it's not completely surprising, but it's also a good reminder for my colleagues who work in pre-European archaeology that, yes, these are very precise dates, but you're just dating when the organism died, not necessarily when a human activity took place. And we know about this. There's the same problem in radiocarbon dating. It's called the old wood problem, and this is sort of the old corals problem. You're getting dates that are a few decades too early, but we're not getting anything that is centuries too early, right? I didn't get any dates back that date to the 1400s or 1500s CE, which would suggest that maybe they're recycling building material from much more ancient structures from the island, from the marae that were built historically. Um, the other thing this sort of project has started me thinking of, in addition to wanting to go back and resample some of the houses that we've already sampled, sample additional houses, not only in Mangareva, but in places like the Tuamotus and the Australs, or encouraging my colleagues to do more of this kind of research, is the idea of this kind of coral heritage, coral building as a sort of terrestrial form of maritime heritage. So we have an archive of um, corals from reefs that existed in the recent past that were impacted by human behavior. What else can they tell us about? What else can they tell us about how coral adapts to either removal of material from the reef, which can be because of human activity, but it can also be due to things like storm surges. How do reefs rebound after there's some kind of event that
1 minute,
changes the
James.
size and shape? I'm nearly done.
All good.
Yeah. So that's another kind of line of research that I haven't really developed yet, but it's something that I'm really interesting. And so if there's anyone who works with corals, and I've spoken to a few people who work in the maritime heritage area, people who work in the GeoReefs lab and geosciences here at the University of Sydney, about this idea of can we kind of use this archive of materials that tells us about corals in this part of Polynesia in the recent past to help us think about how we live with the coral reefs that are around us in the present. And then finally, the connection of this material to the communities who still live in the islands, and their interests in, how can we kind of find more information about their ancestors' houses that people were living in during the last 200 years or less. Um, so that's it